Hello, I'm Dr. Jongsma. I'm a clinical psychologist and an author, co-author, and series editor of a large series of treatment planning books for mental health professionals. I'm a current president of All One Body, and I'm serving as an elder for a CRC in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I live. In June of 2022, the Christian Reformed Church Synod will take up debate on the report of the Committee to Articulate a Foundation-Laying Biblical Theology of Human Sexuality, referred to in short as the Human Sexuality Report, or HSR. The report was very predictably settled on a hardline judgment against same-sex marriage. The intellectual theologizing has been done now, and all that is left is to apply the rejecting conclusions to God's children who are LGBT Christians. My hope is that the delegates to the 2022 Synod will raise strong challenge to the foundation laid by the HSR. This strong challenge must be grounded in a more compassionate biblical interpretation of relevant texts, which takes cultural and historical context into account, and aligns understanding of these passages with our understanding of the redemptive message of God's love and justice within the whole of Scripture. For example, the most frequently cited clobber passage of Romans 1:26-27 is interpreted by traditionalist scholars as if Paul is speaking about homosexual Christians today who love the Lord and were created by God with their same-sex orientation and are in a covenant relationship with a spouse. But other notable Reformed theologians have concluded that the folks in Paul's culture to whom he was referring were choosing to practice homosexual acts for exploitative, hedonistic pleasure, often with young boys, or for idolatrous rituals. These scholars have concluded that this Roman passage applies to sordid, unnatural homosexual acts that were performed by godless, evil people of power, and often in temples dedicated to idolatrous sexual passion and shrine prostitution. These were the obscene days of Tiberius and Caligula and Nero, after all. Even the heterosexual acts, if they were done in this same callous, unholy, unloving way, would be just as condemnable. There is absolutely no application of condemnation here that's applied to Christian, Christ-serving, married gays who worship with us in the pew every Sunday. Cultural and historical contexts are important. We often use the cultural context to enlighten us and discount other scriptural directives, for example, those regarding divorce or slavery or lending money or foods that are considered unclean or women's hairstyles and clothing and jewelry that were forbidden. But these references by Paul to homosexual acts are treated as if they can be applied at face value to our modern understanding of same-sex orientation that's experienced by Christian gay couples who seek to love and serve the Lord. This refusal to consider cultural context of St. Paul's writing results in simplistic, fallacious, judgmental attitudes of, quote, the Bible is crystal clear about condemning homosexual practice. It is not. In 2016, a Classis Grand Rapids East Study Committee wrote a report on biblical and theological support currently offered by Christian proponents of same-sex marriage. I was on that study committee. In this report, we summarized guidelines for interpreting Scripture according to a Reformed hermeneutic. 4 of those guidelines can be stated in brief as follows. 1. Scripture was originally addressed to people in specific cultural and historical contexts. A good interpretation of Scripture will identify the degree of continuity and discontinuity between the original context and today's context. 2. Scripture's overall purpose is the redemptive revelation of God in Jesus Christ. The Bible cannot be read simply as a book of rules or timeless statements, but rather as the story of redemption. 3. Scripture interprets Scripture. Any particular passage must be interpreted in the light of the whole passage of Scripture. And 4. More obscure passages of Scripture must be interpreted in light of clearer ones. There must be coherence between the parts and the whole. In light of these biblical interpretation guidelines, I suggest that all traditionalists and all inclusionists can agree that our God is a God of love. Consider 1 John 4, verse 8. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. See also passages in Psalm 36, 1 Kings 8, 1 John 4, or Romans 8, or 1 John 3. Many passages would refer to God as love. In addition, all traditionalists and inclusionists can agree that our God is a God of justice. Consider Luke 17, 7 and 8. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And there are similar passages in Matthew 23 and in Romans and in Job and in Hebrews. Many passages refer to God's justice. So, all agree that our God is a God of love and justice. No argument from traditionalists nor from inclusionists. Furthermore, most traditionalists and all inclusionists would agree that same-sex-oriented people do not choose their sexual orientation any more than opposite-sex-attracted people do, but are created and they're shaped into their orientation by God's choosing. Even the 1973 report on homosexuality agreed to this. And finally, all inclusionists, but no traditionalists, would agree that to deny a person a basic human need and desire for intimacy, touch, and cherishing that simply reveals their human nature drive and does not violate God's love command is not kind, is not just, is not logical, and is not reasonable for same-sex or even for opposite-sex-oriented married Christians. Traditionalists argue that it is God's will for gay Christians to be prevented from intimate sexual activity, but it is not God's will for heterosexual to be prevented from this same highly valued intimacy. This traditional position of prohibition of gay intimacy is not an interpretation of Scripture that's consistent with God as loving or just. How can one conceive of a God of love and justice creating a same-sex-oriented child of his who experiences the same needs and drives that heterosexuals experience? But then God demands that this same-sex-oriented person be excluded from ever satisfying his or her human need. That interpretation of Scripture is not consistent with the whole of Scripture, in which God's loving and just character is repeatedly revealed. That interpretation of Scripture depicts God as harsh and discriminatory and unfair and comfortable with causing human pain, loneliness, self-loathing, and suffering. Do we honestly believe it is consistent with God's loving character as we have come to know it through Scripture, that the one who created all of mankind would say to this one group of his image bearers who love and seek to serve Jesus Christ, "You must live alone. It is sin for you to live with a loving partner"? No way. Isn't this traditional judgmental interpretation simply reading the Bible as a book of rules or timeless statements? Isn't this interpretation ignoring the light of the whole of Scripture? Isn't this interpretation ignoring the guideline that there must be coherence between parts and the whole of Scripture? Doesn't this traditional interpretation ignore the cultural context of the texts? I implore the delegates to Synod to challenge the HSR condemning interpretation, because I believe this interpretation does not follow the 4 guidelines for Reformed exegesis, and it is inconsistent with our understanding of God as a God of love and justice. Thank you.